Your wrists are bound so tightly that the rope cuts into your flesh. Guards drag you toward a metal chair covered in hundreds of sharpened iron spikes. You know what comes next. Everyone in the square knows. The screaming always starts the same way. This was not a nightmare, this was the iron chair, one of medieval Europe's most terrifying instruments of torture. For centuries, it served as both punishment and spectacle, a grotesque theater of human suffering designed to break bodies and terrorize populations. Today, we descend into the dark chambers where this device inflicted unimaginable agony, where executioners perfected the art of slow death, and where victims endured hours of being literally cooked alive. The iron chair was not simply about pain, it was about control, confession, and entertainment. It was about making an example so horrifying that entire communities would fall into line. And most chillingly, it was about the calculated efficiency with which human beings engineered devices specifically designed to maximize suffering while prolonging life. Before we begin this journey into darkness, understand that what follows is documented historical fact. These events happened, these devices existed. Real people suffered and died in ways that challenge our modern comprehension of cruelty. This is not entertainment. This is a stark reminder of what humans are capable of inflicting upon one another. The records are clear. The testimonies are preserved. The devices themselves have survived in museums across Europe. And the lessons they teach us about the darkest corners of human nature remain as relevant today as they were 500 years ago. In the depth of winter, in the year 1577, a woman named Catherine de Chaise was led to the iron chair in the town square of Nuremberg. She had been accused of witchcraft, a charge as common as it was deadly in an era gripped by paranoia and religious fervor. The crowd gathered not out of sympathy, but out of morbid fascination. They came to watch justice as they understood it, unfold in real time. Catherine's crime, according to the magistrates, was communing with demons and causing the death of livestock through supernatural means. Her real crime was likely being an unmarried woman who practiced herbal medicine in a society that feared female independence. But the distinction between accusation and truth mattered little once you were strapped to the chair. As they forced her onto the seat, the spikes penetrated her back, thighs, and arms. Each movement caused fresh wounds. The restraints were tightened until blood began to seep from beneath the iron bands, and then the executioner bent down and lit the brazier beneath the chair. This is where Catherine's ordeal truly began. This is where hours of systematic torture would either break her will or end her life. The iron chair was not designed for quick death. It was designed for prolonged agony. It was a machine that turned the human body into a canvas for suffering, and the executioner into an artist of pain. To understand how such devices came to exist, we must first understand the world that created them. Historical context. A world built on fear, medieval Europe was a civilization perpetually on the edge of chaos. Between the 14th and 17th centuries, the continent was ravaged by plague, war, famine, and religious upheaval. The Black Death had killed nearly a third of the population, leaving behind a traumatized society desperate for explanations and someone to blame. Into this void stepped the church and the state, twin authorities that claimed divine and earthly power. They promised order in exchange for absolute obedience. They promised salvation in exchange for confession, and they promised protection in exchange for identifying enemies within. The result was a culture of paranoia. Heretics, witches, Jews, Muslims, political dissidents, and anyone who questioned authority became targets. The Inquisition, established in the 13th century, had by the 15th century evolved into a sophisticated bureaucracy of persecution. Torture was not merely permitted, it was required. The Church published manuals detailing approved methods for extracting confessions. Among these methods, the iron chair occupied a special place. Unlike the rack, which stretched the body, or the boot, which crushed the legs, the iron chair attacked every part of the victim simultaneously. It was comprehensive in its cruelty. It was, in the eyes of its creators, efficient. The chair appeared in various forms across Europe. The Spanish Inquisition had its version, covered in spikes and often heated. Germanic states favored designs with adjustable restraints and removable spike plates. Italian city-states developed chairs that could be tilted backward, forcing the victim's weight onto the spikes. Each variation reflected local preferences for inflicting pain. But why create such devices? The stated reason was confession. Authorities believed that physical pain would drive out demonic influence and force heretics to admit their crimes. Torture was seen not as cruelty, but as medicine for the soul, a necessary evil to save the community from contamination. The unstated reason was control. Public torture served as spectacular entertainment and devastating propaganda. When people watched someone die on the iron chair, they learned what happened to those who stepped out of line. They learned that questioning authority could lead to unimaginable suffering. They learned to be afraid. This was governance through terror. It was social engineering through brutality, and it worked. For centuries, the mere threat of torture kept populations compliant, kept lips sealed, kept dangerous thoughts suppressed. The iron chair was not just a tool of punishment, it was a pillar of political power. The device engineering agony. The iron chair was not a single standardized device, but rather a category of torture instruments that shared common features. At its most basic, it consisted of a metal seat fitted with hundreds of iron spikes, restraints for the wrists and ankles, and often a heating mechanism beneath. The spikes themselves were carefully designed. They were not long enough to cause immediate fatal wounds, but were sharpened enough to penetrate flesh with the victim's own body weight. Some chairs had spikes of varying lengths, creating a landscape of pain across the victim's body. Shorter spikes pierced the back and buttocks, while longer ones targeted the thighs and arms. The restraints were equally sophisticated. Iron bands encircled the wrists, ankles, and sometimes the neck. These were tightened until they bit into flesh, preventing any movement that might allow the victim to shift their weight away from the spikes. Some designs included a metal headpiece that held the skull in place, forcing the victim to stare forward as their body was destroyed. But the most diabolical feature was the heat. Beneath the chair sat a brazier or fire pit. As the metal gradually warmed, the victim's suffering intensified in stages. First came the discomfort of sitting on warmed metal, then the pain of heated spikes pressing into flesh, then the smell of burning skin. Finally, the indescribable agony of being slowly roasted alive. The heat served multiple purposes. It increased pain without additional physical effort from the executioner. It created dramatic visual effects as smoke rose from the victim's body. And it ensured that even if the victim survived the initial torture, infection from the burns would likely kill them within days. Executioners controlled the intensity of suffering by adjusting the fire. A slow burn could last for hours, giving interrogators time to ask questions and demand confessions. A hot fire could cook flesh in minutes, serving as swift punishment rather than prolonged interrogation. The choice depended on the victim's crime and the audience's appetite for spectacle. Some chairs included additional features: armrests lined with smaller spikes, footrests designed to crush toes, a spike-covered backrest that could be cranked forward, driving the victim's body deeper onto the seat spikes. These modifications reflected centuries of accumulated knowledge about human pain, a dark science refined through countless experiments on living subjects. The construction of these devices required skilled craftsmen. Blacksmiths who made the iron chair were specialists, often working directly for courts or inquisitorial tribunals. They understood metallurgy, human anatomy, and the mechanics of restraint. They were engineers of suffering, and their work was considered legitimate, even honorable, employment. The process, from accusation to agony. The journey to the iron chair typically began with an accusation. In the climate of religious and political paranoia that characterized medieval Europe, accusations could come from anywhere. a jealous neighbor, a business rival, a spurned lover, or even anonymous denunciations dropped into church collection boxes. Once accused, the victim was arrested and brought before authorities. In cases involving heresy or witchcraft, this meant appearing before inquisitors who operated under special legal privileges. They were not bound by the same evidentiary standards as secular courts. Rumor, reputation, and even dreams could serve as evidence against the accused. Interrogation began with verbal questioning. The accused was asked to confess their crimes and name accomplices. If they refused or their answers were deemed insufficient, the inquisitors would order the application of torture. This was presented as a mercy, an opportunity to save one's soul through truthful admission of sin. The victim would be taken to the torture chamber, often located in the basement of the courthouse or castle. These rooms were designed to amplify fear. Dim lighting, damp stone walls, and the display of various instruments created an atmosphere of dread. The iron chair sat prominently, its purpose unmistakable. Before torture began, the victim was given a final chance to confess. This was both a legal formality and a psychological tactic. Seeing the chair, knowing what was about to happen, many people broke and confessed to crimes they had never committed. Those who maintained their innocence were prepared for the ordeal. Preparation involved stripping the victim naked. This served practical purposes, preventing clothing from cushioning the spikes or catching fire, but it also served to humiliate and dehumanize. Nakedness removed the last protection of dignity and identity, transforming the person into a body to be processed. Guards would force the victim onto the chair. The initial seating was itself an act of torture, as hundreds of spikes penetrated flesh. Witnesses reported hearing screams at this moment before the heating even began. The body's natural instinct to pull away made the restraints essential. Iron bands were clamped around wrists and ankles, then tightened until they cut into skin. Once secured, the questioning would resume. Inquisitors would ask their questions calmly, methodically, as if the victim were not impaled on dozens of spikes. Meanwhile, an assistant would light the brazier beneath the chair. The fire was carefully managed, never too hot at first. The torture was designed to build gradually, allowing maximum time for confession. The suffering, what victims endured. Understanding what happened to those strapped into the iron chair requires confronting the limits of human endurance and the mechanics of pain. The torture operated on multiple levels simultaneously, each compounding the others into a crescendo of agony that few could withstand for long. The first wave of pain came from the spikes themselves. Hundreds of sharpened iron points pressed into the back, buttocks, thighs, arms, and sometimes the calves and feet. These were not deep penetrating wounds. The spikes were designed to pierce only the first layers of flesh. This ensured that the victim would not bleed out quickly, but would instead suffer prolonged torment from countless small wounds. The body's instinctive response to pain made everything worse. When we feel acute pain, our muscles contract and we attempt to move away from the source. But movement while seated on the iron chair only drove the spikes deeper or created new wounds as the body shifted. The restraints prevented any meaningful escape, trapping victims in a position where every breath, every muscle twitch caused additional injury. As the metal began to heat, a new dimension of suffering emerged. The warmth was gradual at first, almost imperceptible. But iron is an excellent conductor of heat, and as the fire beneath the chair intensified, the entire structure became a radiating source of thermal torture. The spikes, already embedded in flesh, acted as tiny brands burning from the inside out. Witnesses who observed these sessions described the progression of symptoms. First, the victim would begin sweating profusely as their body desperately tried to cool itself. Then, the skin would redden and blister where it contacted the heated metal. The smell of burning flesh would fill the chamber, a sickly, sweet odor that mixed with the smoke rising from the victim's body. The screaming was constant and intense. Historical accounts describe cries so loud they could be heard throughout the castle or town square. Some victims screamed themselves hoarse within minutes. Others maintained consciousness and vocal capacity for hours, their shrieks punctuated only by moments of interrogation. Psychological torture accompanied the physical. Victims knew they were being watched. In public executions, crowds gathered to witness the spectacle. In private interrogations, inquisitors and court officials observed coldly, taking notes, asking questions, treating the victim's agony as merely a tool to be calibrated. The mind breaks before the body in many cases. Faced with unrelenting pain and no prospect of escape, victims would confess to anything. They would name innocent people as accomplices. They would admit to impossible crimes. They would say whatever they thought might make the torture stop. This is why torture is notoriously unreliable for obtaining truth, though authorities of the era either did not understand this or did not care. Documented cases, real victims, real stories. The historical record preserves numerous specific cases of iron chair torture, though many more undoubtedly went undocumented. These accounts come from trial records, executioner memoirs, witness testimonies, and the occasional diary of someone who observed these proceedings. Each case offers a window into the human cost of systematic cruelty. In 1598, in the German city of Würzburg, a woman named Anna Hansen was accused of witchcraft by 3 separate neighbors. The accusations claimed she had cursed their crops and caused miscarriages in their livestock. Anna was a midwife, which automatically made her suspect in an era that conflated medical knowledge with supernatural power. Trial records indicate Anna denied all charges initially. She was subjected to the iron chair in what was described as a formal interrogation. The torture session lasted approximately 3 hours. Court documents note that Anna confessed after 2 hours to consorting with demons and attending Sabbaths where she had allegedly danced with the devil. She also named 7 other women as fellow witches. These women were arrested within days. 5 of them were also tortured and confessed. All 8 were burned at the stake within a month of Anna's initial confession. Modern historians recognize this as a classic example of how torture produced false confessions that cascaded into mass persecution. Another documented case comes from Spain in 1623. Don Garcia de Mendoza, a minor nobleman, was accused of blasphemy and heretical statements questioning the authority of the church. His true crime appears to have been a land dispute with a more powerful family who had connections to the Inquisition. Garcia was subjected to the iron chair as part of his interrogation. Unlike many victims, he refused to confess even under extreme torture. Inquisition records note that the session lasted over 4 hours and that Garcia lost consciousness multiple times. Each time, he was revived with cold water and the questioning resumed. Eventually, Garcia did make a confession, but it was carefully worded to admit only minor theological errors rather than full heresy. His social status may have afforded him some protection. He was not executed, but was instead sentenced to house arrest and required to pay a substantial fine. He survived the iron chair, but carried the physical and psychological scars for the rest of his life. The city of Nuremberg maintained particularly detailed records of its torture proceedings. Franz Schmidt, the city's executioner from 1573 to 1617, kept a diary that included descriptions of 361 executions and numerous torture sessions. His entries are remarkably matter-of-fact, describing the iron chair as simply another tool in his professional repertoire. The executioners, men who worked the machine. To operate the iron chair required not just physical strength, but specific knowledge and a particular mindset. The executioners who managed these torture sessions were professionals, often hereditary specialists who passed their knowledge from father to son. They occupied a strange social position, necessary for maintaining order, yet deeply stigmatized by their work. Executioners were trained in what we might today call applied anatomy. They needed to understand how much pain the human body could endure without dying, how to recognize signs of impending death, and how to maximize suffering while preserving consciousness. This knowledge was passed down through apprenticeship, with experienced executioners teaching novices the craft of controlled cruelty. Franz Schmidt, whose diary provides invaluable historical insight, described his work with clinical detachment. He viewed torture as a necessary function of justice, no different from other judicial procedures. His entries record the methods used, the duration of sessions, and whether confessions were obtained, all in the same neutral tone one might use to describe carpentry or farming. The social isolation of executioners was profound. They were required to live outside town walls, could not attend regular church services, and were forbidden from socializing with most citizens. Their children could not attend regular schools. This ostracism was based on the belief that touching death and causing suffering made executioners ritually unclean, contaminated by their profession. Yet society desperately needed these men. Without executioners, the apparatus of justice and control would collapse. So communities maintained a hypocritical relationship with these specialists, depending on them while simultaneously shunning them. Executioners were well paid for their work, receiving fees for each torture session and execution, often accumulating substantial wealth despite their pariah status. Some executioners developed a grim pride in their expertise. They saw themselves as skilled craftsmen performing difficult but essential work. They took care of their tools, maintaining the iron chair and other devices in good working order. They studied human reactions to pain, learning to read subtle signs that indicated a confession was imminent or that death was approaching too quickly. The psychological toll of this work must have been immense, though historical records rarely address it directly. How does a person maintain sanity while regularly inflicting extreme suffering? Some executioners apparently turned to alcohol. Others developed elaborate justifications, framing their work as a form of religious service that purified the community by removing evil. Interestingly, some executioners also served as healers. Because they possessed unique anatomical knowledge from their work with torture and execution, they were sometimes consulted for setting bones or treating injuries. This dual role as both destroyer and healer created a strange paradox, further complicating their position in society. Public spectacle, torture as entertainment. When the iron chair was used in public settings, it transformed torture into theater. Executions and torture sessions were major social events that drew crowds from across the region. Town squares would fill with spectators, from nobility viewing from special platforms to commoners jostling for position. This was entertainment, education, and intimidation rolled into one spectacular display. The staging of these events was carefully orchestrated. Announcements would be made days in advance, detailing the crimes of the accused and the punishment to be administered. On the day of the torture, the victim would be paraded through streets, sometimes on a cart, with town criers announcing their sins. This procession served to maximize humiliation and build anticipation. The crowd's reaction to public torture varied. Some spectators came primarily for entertainment, treating the event like any other public performance. Vendors would sell food and drink. Children would be hoisted onto shoulders for a better view. The atmosphere could be almost festive, a disturbing reminder of how normalized violence had become. Others attended out of religious obligation or social pressure. Witnessing punishment was considered a civic duty, a way of demonstrating solidarity with community values and authority structures. Absence from major executions could itself draw suspicion, suggesting sympathy with heretics or criminals. The spectacle served multiple propaganda purposes. It demonstrated the power and reach of authority, showing that no one was beyond punishment. It reinforced religious and moral boundaries, making clear what behaviors would not be tolerated. And it provided a communal catharsis, allowing the crowd to project their fears and frustrations onto a designated scapegoat. The visual and auditory elements of iron chair torture made it particularly effective as spectacle. The smoke rising from the victim's body, the screams echoing across the square, the smell of burning flesh, these sensory experiences created powerful memories that spectators would carry with them. The message was clear: this could happen to you. Some authorities understood the theatrical nature of these events and played to the crowd. Executioners would pause between stages of torture, allowing time for the victim's screams to resonate. Inquisitors would pose questions loudly so all could hear the charges and the extracted confessions. The entire procedure was choreographed for maximum impact. Not everyone approved of this spectacle. Even in medieval times, some voices questioned the morality and utility of public torture. These critics were usually isolated intellectuals or religious reformers who lacked the power to change established practices. The machinery of terror was too deeply embedded in governance structures to be easily dismantled. The end of an era. Why the practice finally ceased. The gradual abandonment of judicial torture, including the iron chair, was not a sudden humanitarian awakening, but rather a complex process driven by changing legal philosophies, political shifts, and evolving social attitudes. This transformation occurred unevenly across Europe, with some regions abandoning torture centuries before others. The Enlightenment of the 18th century brought new philosophical frameworks that challenged traditional justifications for torture. Thinkers like Cesare Beccaria argued that torture was both morally wrong and practically ineffective. His 1764 treatise on crimes and punishments systematically demolished the legal and rational arguments for torture, influencing reform movements across Europe. Legal reforms followed philosophical critique. Prussia abolished torture in 1754, followed by Saxony in 1770, Austria in 1776, and France in 1788. These changes were often driven by monarchs influenced by Enlightenment ideals who saw modern rational governance as incompatible with medieval torture practices. However, actual practice often lagged behind official prohibition. The end of the witch trials in the late 17th and early 18th centuries removed one major justification for torture. As educated elites increasingly rejected belief in witchcraft as superstition, the interrogation methods used to obtain confessions from supposed witches lost their legitimacy. This included the iron chair and similar devices. Political revolution played a role as well. The French Revolution, despite its own violent excesses, explicitly rejected the old regime's torture methods. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen proclaimed human dignity and individual rights that were incompatible with judicial torture. Similar revolutionary movements across Europe carried these values forward. Economic and social modernization also contributed. As societies industrialized and urbanized, traditional community structures weakened. The tight social control maintained through public torture became less necessary and less effective. New forms of punishment emerged, particularly imprisonment, that better suited industrial-age concepts of discipline and reform. The iron chair and similar devices were gradually removed from use, often being stored in castle dungeons or governmental warehouses. Some were eventually destroyed. Others found their way into private collections or eventually into museums where they serve as historical artifacts and reminders of humanity's capacity for cruelty. Yet we must not imagine this transition as complete or permanent. Torture never truly disappeared, it merely evolved. The 20th century would see industrialized violence on a scale medieval torturers could never have imagined. And in the 21st century, debates about enhanced interrogation techniques remind us that the underlying tensions between security and human rights persist. Lessons and reflections. What the iron chair teaches us. The iron chair was not an aberration. It was not the product of a few sadistic individuals or a single corrupt institution. It was a normalized tool of governance, accepted by legal systems, sanctioned by religious authorities, and witnessed by ordinary citizens who often approved of its use. This normalization of cruelty is perhaps the most disturbing lesson the device teaches us. How did societies reach a point where watching someone be slowly cooked alive became acceptable? The answer lies in the power of ideology to reshape moral perception. When authorities convinced populations that certain people, heretics, witches, traitors, represented existential threats to social order and spiritual salvation, extreme measures became not just permissible, but necessary. The creation of outgroups is essential to this process. The victims of the iron chair were first dehumanized through accusation and trial. They were labeled as enemies of God, threats to the community, or agents of supernatural evil. Once stripped of their humanity through rhetoric and ritual, their suffering could be observed without empathy. This dynamic is not confined to medieval Europe. Throughout history and into the present day, societies have found ways to classify certain humans as less than human, thereby justifying their mistreatment. The specific technologies of cruelty change, but the underlying psychological and social mechanisms remain remarkably consistent. The Iron Chair also teaches us about the bureaucratization of evil. The torture chambers of medieval Europe operated within legal frameworks. There were rules about who could be tortured, for how long, and under what circumstances. Executioners were licensed professionals. Confessions were documented by scribes. The entire apparatus had the veneer of legitimacy and process. This bureaucratic structure allowed individuals to participate in extreme cruelty while psychologically distancing themselves from responsibility. The inquisitor could claim he was merely following church law. The executioner was just doing his job. The scribe was only keeping records. Each person played a small role in a larger machine, making it easier to ignore the moral weight of the whole. We must also recognize the Iron Chair as evidence of human ingenuity applied to dark purposes. The engineering that went into these devices, the careful calibration of pain, the understanding of human physiology, all of this represents intellectual effort directed toward maximizing suffering. It reminds us that intelligence and creativity are not inherently moral forces. Finally, the history of the Iron Chair challenges us to remain vigilant against the return of such practices. The abolition of judicial torture was a hard-won achievement, the result of centuries of philosophical argument and political struggle. But it was never inevitable, and it is not irreversible. Whenever fear and insecurity dominate political discourse, the temptation to sacrifice human rights for perceived security returns. The Iron Chair exists now primarily in museums, a relic of a brutal past that most modern people would prefer to forget. Yet there is value in remembering, in forcing ourselves to confront the uncomfortable truth that these devices were real, were used on real people, and were considered legitimate by societies not so different from our own. Catherine Deschays, whose story opened this exploration, died on the Iron Chair after confessing to crimes she almost certainly did not commit. Anna Hansen and 7 other women were burned alive based on confessions extracted through torture. Don Garcia de Mendoza survived but carried the scars until his death. These were not isolated incidents, but part of a systematic practice that continued for centuries. The victims of the Iron Chair were mothers and fathers, daughters and sons. They were people with hopes and fears, with relationships and daily routines. They were human beings who experienced unimaginable pain, who screamed until their voices gave out, who died in ways designed to maximize their suffering. They deserve to be remembered not as abstract historical statistics, but as individuals who endured horrors we can barely comprehend. The Iron Chair also reminds us that progress is not linear and civilization is fragile. The societies that created these devices had art and literature, had laws and institutions, had religious teachings about love and compassion. Yet they also had torture chambers. They demonstrate that cultural sophistication does not prevent cruelty and that moral regression is always possible. In studying the Iron Chair, we study ourselves. We examine the human capacity for cruelty, for moral rationalization, for normalizing the abnormal. We see how fear can be weaponized, how authority can be abused, how ordinary people can participate in extraordinary evil. These are not comfortable lessons, but they are necessary ones. As we close this examination of one of history's darkest instruments, we should carry forward several commitments. First, to remember that human rights are not natural or inevitable, but constructed and maintained through constant vigilance. Second, to resist the dehumanization of any group, regardless of how threatening they are portrayed. Third, to question authority, especially when it justifies cruelty in the name of security or salvation. The Iron Chair is gone from our justice systems, but the impulses that created it remain in human nature. The desire for absolute security, the fear of the other, the belief that extreme measures are sometimes necessary, these attitudes persist. Our challenge is to acknowledge these impulses while refusing to let them guide our actions or shape our institutions. This has been a journey into darkness, but darkness illuminated by historical truth. The iron chair existed. People suffered and died on it, and we, living in more enlightened times, bear responsibility for ensuring that such instruments of systematic cruelty never return. That responsibility requires memory, requires education, requires constant moral reflection. May we remember the victims, may we learn from history, and may we build societies where human dignity is protected, where torture is unthinkable, and where the iron chair remains forever a museum piece, a warning from the past rather than a tool of the present.